So now that we talked about NetBackup for Exchange and what granular recovery technology really means, let's go through some examples of how you can actually configure the policy engine within NetBackup to utilize granular recovery technology. So the first thing to keep in mind when you're doing this is that there's a few requirements for your policies. And the first one is that when you utilize granular recovery technology, you have to use disk. So that means when you're configuring your policy engine, you're going to have to keep in mind that that storage location will have to be disk. The other thing you're going to want to keep in mind is that as you do disaster recovery in some form, that will also dictate the type of location you're using. You may want to use tape, since that is a technology you can offsite or send off location for disaster recovery. Or maybe you've implemented some sort of disk-to-disk strategy where you're doing replication, or you are sending to a second tiered storage that is in a separate location than your primary disk backups. So those are two requirements to just keep in mind, that when you're configuring your policies, you may have to dictate the location based on those. Now, before I get into kind of the details of this, let's talk a little bit about how you can configure policies and how you would set this up. So traditionally, in the past, when you've configured policies, you've had separate lines within the administration console that have things like schedules, retention periods, and other information associated with these. In NetBackup 6.5, we implemented a feature called storage lifecycle policies. And when you implement a storage lifecycle policy over an existing policy, what that allows you to do is really tier that storage off and be able to trigger those tiers based on some sort of event. So in that situation, rather than having policy that may be related in your head, you can actually relate those right within the policy. So you have one policy and one interface that take care of the whole storage lifecycle of doing an Exchange backup, including this requirement of backing up to disk, replicating to tape, changing the retention period, and so forth. So keep that in mind. Storage lifecycle policies can be a great use case of where you want to use Exchange granular recovery backups. So let's walk through just kind of an example of how you would configure this policy now. So typically what we find people doing within NetBackup is they do weekly fulls and they'll do daily incrementals on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Then that next week they'll start over on that same basis and do a full again. Keep doing incrementals after that. So in this type of scenario, you have a policy or a schedule set up where you're really doing full backups once a week, dailies on an incremental basis. Now for this situation, you would probably want to configure your retention for your fulls to be 8 days. You could also configure your incrementals so that you have a sliding 1 week window. So when you actually go and configure this within the NetBackup console, the first thing you'd want to do within your storage lifecycle policy is configure these full types of backups. So your first step here will be to configure a policy with one schedule that is weekly. You'll be doing fulls. Your retention level will be 8 days. And if you want to utilize that granular recovery technology, you're going to have to send this to disk. And the way you enable this within the policy is there is a checkbox that is labeled with the text Enable Document Recovery. So if you hit that checkbox right within the policy and you set up this schedule, you'll have your weekly fulls that let you do document or granular recovery. Now the second step, or the second schedule within this storage lifecycle policy, would be to have a schedule of doing daily incremental backups. And again, you would keep the same retention period of 8 days. And you could send this now to disk or to tape. If you're using an existing policy engine, you will have to keep this as disk since that storage location is the same. Now the Enable Document Recovery is at a policy level, so both of these schedules here will actually have that enabled. But for doing actual granular recovery, you will only be able to do those from full backups. Granular recovery cannot be done from an incremental level backup. So when you actually browse into the recovery interface, you would be using the full backups to extract individual items, whereas the incrementals could be used to do the full backups. And then the final step here is for disaster recovery. And this is really where you would create that second hierarchy in the storage lifecycle policy. And these you could do weekly. And again, you'll be taking full backups or really just copies of existing full backups. But you can change the retention period now to perhaps be 30 days or something that's more disaster recovery orientated. And you don't have to send it to disk anymore. You could send it to second tier disk, tape, or any other type of medium that you're using as kind of an off-site or disaster recovery scenario. So now the nice thing about this is you have one policy that is configured with two different schedules, a second tier to do duplications within your lifecycle policy, and everything's administered as one policy. It spawns as many jobs as it needs, it allows you to do granular recovery, it lets you utilize disk and tape, but it's still self-contained within one administration interface. So it's much easier to manage and look at the status of this while still having a fairly complicated or a fairly robust scenario for how you're actually doing those backups and managing that life cycle all the way through to disaster recovery retention. Now the last thing I want to talk about a little bit is what you'll actually see within the activity monitor of NetBackup when you do these backups. Now traditionally when you look at doing a NetBackup backup, you have some sort of scenario where you go from 0% progress to 100%. And within this time, you can open up the green running guy within the activity monitor, and you'll see a number of things happen. You might be able to see what the speed is. You might look at the duration, or just simply how much data went through. So as you monitor these things, you think of these on a 0 to 100% basis. But when you're doing granular recovery technology, what you'll notice is that towards the end of the backup, say maybe around 80%, data is not being processed anymore. All the data has been backed up, and this time period spent towards the end of the job is really NetBackup communicating with Exchange and indexing the individual items in there and really trying to figure out what's in that backup image so that you can do the granular recovery. So the thing to keep in mind is, while you might think of this as kind of overhead associated with the job process, whereas in the past you've only had to spend this much time doing the backup, you're eliminating a whole second level backup, because when you do the MAPI level backup, you would be doing two types of backups. So by eliminating this, you're adding a small overhead, but that pales in comparison to doing the full level backup that you would have to if you didn't have granular recovery technology. So just keep that in mind, that when you're looking at the duration or the throughput, the overall speed may not be as accurate because you have this time spent doing other things besides moving data. But again, overall, you're still saving dramatically more time because you eliminate those backups. And that's really what granular recovery technology is all about. We decided to put granular recovery in there because it was inefficient to do two-level backups. And so by having a more simple administration interface through the storage lifecycle policies, reducing the amount of time and the amount of storage to do backups, we've been able to dramatically improve NetBackup backup capabilities around Exchange and other applications that utilize this granular recovery technology. So hopefully you found this video informational about just how to enable granular recovery technology and how you can use it in your environment. If you want more information, you can visit our website and register for a live demo webcast where we'll actually show the product in its interface and go through exactly how you would do this and give you more information about how to use granular recovery technology for Exchange.